Well, more than enough signatures have been acquired to hold a referendum for Alberta to separate. Also, 90% of Alberta's provincial workers have voted to strike. Carney picks an Edmonton riding MP as part of his cabinet, and Rick McIver is the new Speaker of the Alberta Legislature. Lots to talk about in provincial politics, and here to break it down is legislative correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, welcome back. Good to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so Tyler, the Alberta Prosperity Project, so this is one of the groups pushing for a separation referendum. They revealed the question it wants to put to Alberta voters this year. And Tyler, I also understand that they've received more than the required number of signatures. I think they're needing 177,000 to trigger a referendum, and I think at last count they were at 225,000. So how does this compare to Quebec's referendum?
Well, there's a couple points here. The first one, the question. In 1995, if people remember, the Quebec question was really, really complicated and long and wordy, and there was some sense from the sovereigntists at the end of that process that maybe they kind of messed that up by making the question too convoluted, or they'd been, had the rug pulled out from under them. So in this case, the question that the Alberta Prosperity Project wants to put forward is really quite simple. It's, do you agree that Alberta shall become an independent country and cease to be a province of Canada? So really straightforward, really clear. And of course, after the Quebec 1995 referendum, there was a reference case to the Supreme Court of Canada on how all of this would happen. And the Clarity Act was passed that sets out a bunch of rules basically on how a secession referendum would happen and what would happen if that won. And one of those things that the Clarity Act sets out is the requirement of having a very, very clear question. So that's presumably what they're trying to do here with the straightforwardness of that question. The signature side of things is a little bit more complicated. It is true that once the changes to the Citizen Initiative Act come into effect, that it will only be 10% of people who voted in the last provincial election. So it was about just shy of 1.8 million people voted in the 2023 election. So 10% of that, about, as you say, 177,000 signatures. The old threshold was quite a bit higher than that. And the Alberta Prosperity Project has also said that they're sort of aiming for a higher bar than that bare minimum before they push this thing forward. The argument being that they don't just want to have a referendum, they want to have one and then win it. So, and then of course, not only this, this isn't like a change.org petition either, right? This needs to go to the government in a formal fashion and all that kind of stuff before it could end up on a ballot at some point. So we'll see when that happens. Premier Danielle Smith has sort of said that if it's going to happen, she'd prefer it happens next year. But the folks pushing for this want it to happen a lot more quickly than that. So that very much remains to be seen.
I think they're looking at this fall already. So interesting. Okay, so meanwhile, Alberta Premier Smith, she's certainly declined to be critical of these types of groups. And apparently there are a few reasons for that. So what are they, Tyler?
Yeah, so my impression of it is a couple things. The first is that the Alberta's conservative movement, Alberta's right wing, is sort of always at risk of coming apart at the seams. And the United Conservative Party is sort of cobbled together from different components of the conservative movement in this province. So if there's a significant stream of conservatives who believe that Alberta should separate, the premier risks having another party form on her right flank, and that causes electoral problems down the road, obviously. So I think that's part of it. The second part of it is that if you look at the polling, there's quite a distinct partisan divide on people who are really, really mad about Alberta's place within Confederation and who are sympathetic to separation. And about 2/3 of the people who voted for the United Conservatives in the last election say that they would vote for separation from Canada. So so Danielle Smith is essentially leading a party that has a lot of people who are either hard separatists or sympathetic in some fashion. So she again jeopardizes her leadership and the cohesiveness of her party if she was to come out really, really strongly and say that. And there was a really, really good indication of sort of the strange position she's in at the moment this week. A reporter asked her what she would say about the possibility that even talking about separation is going to make Alberta seem like a a risky investment climate, and that could have economic consequences. And she very much declined to sort of agree with that, and just said, this is a question that ought to be put to the people who are pushing for this, which is really, really notable, because of course, if she was going to be making an argument against separation without criticizing the people behind it, that might be one of the arguments that she would choose to make. She might choose to say, this is a delicate economic time for Alberta. To have this discussion now is really, really risky. But she didn't. So I think that's probably what's going on in terms of the rationale for how she is approaching this issue.
Okay, all right. Rick McIver, a longtime MLA dating back to the Progressive Conservative days, will be the new Speaker of the Legislature. So, Tyler, any thoughts on this appointment?
Well, it's a big loss for Daniel Smith's cabinet, because he's been around so long, because he's so experienced. He's also been quite a problem solver over the years. In the municipal affairs file has been very, very complicated for the last couple of years. There's been a bunch of new legislation affecting municipalities, and municipalities have been really, really mad about it, frankly. So McIver's experience has been, I think, quite helpful in achieving some of what the provincial government wants to have achieved. For example, this is bringing political parties to Edmonton and Calgary as one example of a file that was quite contentious and quite complicated, and probably the government benefited from McIver's experience. But it needed to be done, and it always helps to have someone in the speaker's chair who's sort of respected across the aisle. Nathan Cooper, who was the former speaker, will now be Alberta's trade representative in Washington. So that's why that position was vacated, and is sitting vacant. And I think it was perhaps today that the sort of traditional process of hauling the new Speaker of the House down the aisle to sit in the chair happened. So we'll see how he does. The legislature has had its contentious moments in the last few months, and Speaker Nathan Cooper was really trying to deal with that. So we'll see how things go for McIver in that role.
And of course, Tuesday was a big day as Canadians got to see who PM Mark Carney picked for his cabinet. But Premier Danielle Smith seems to be fuming over some of these picks, isn't she, Tyler?
She is. She's in particular not that happy with the pick for Environment Minister, which is Julie DeBrusen, a Toronto area MP, who had worked in relatively close quarters with former Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault, and has obviously supported the sort of liberal agenda over the years on carbon tax, things like that. So Smith has basically said, in her view, look, we have another environmental radical in the role. It's hard to imagine who could have been put in that role, though, who the premier would have been happy with. This is all part of the sort of escalating disagreement between Alberta and Ottawa over environmental and industry sort of policy going forward. She was much happier about Tim Hodgson, who's the industry, natural resources kind of minister, who actually has some experience in the oil sector. So Brian Jean said, that he's Alberta's energy minister, said that's sort of all to the good that he's got a little bit of experience. So I guess we'll see, right? I mean, you never know how people are going to get along until they've actually met. We don't really know what the federal government's environmental agenda is going to be, or all of its positions on the oil and gas sector beyond a few of them. So there's certainly, I think, some opportunity for negotiation and discussion on some of this stuff. But it's going to be up to both sides, I suppose, whether or not they want to engage in that.
Yeah. It looks like Carney also picked a rookie Alberta MP for his cabinet. I understand.
My MP, as it happens.
Yeah, I was going to say from Edmonton there. Is this a sign that Carney's government is willing to work with or listen to Albertans?
Possibly. I mean, I think it's probably for the good that there's some Alberta representation in cabinet. This is Eleanor Olszewski, who's the Edmonton Centre MP, replaced Randy Boissonnault as the Liberal candidate. And she does have a cabinet position, particularly a role regarding Prairie's Economic Development Canada, which is sort of an economic development crown corporation that deals with the prairies. So, I think it remains to be seen what that role will look like, just how involved she might be in sort of dealing with some of the disagreements and tensions that exist. But I think it would have been very notable had Carney left either Olszewski or Corey Hogan, the other Alberta MP, out of cabinet. That probably would have been a bit of a snub. So at least we've got one of the two.
Okay, so switching gears here a little bit, we've got 90% of the Alberta Union of Public Employees have voted to strike. Now, these are provincial workers. We're talking everything from jail guards, nurses, fish and wildlife conservation officers, all kinds of stuff, counselors. However, there's no indication that a strike is imminent. So what have you heard, Tyler?
Yeah, so it seems to be, they had a strike vote, and this is just sort of this is upping the ante in negotiations. Really, they're not planning on striking tomorrow or at the end of the week, but they're hoping that negotiations are going to continue. But now they can at least say, look, we've got the overwhelming support of the 24,000 people who are the members of our union, and an overwhelming mandate to strike means that we have an overwhelming mandate to, really, really push for the things that we want in this negotiation. And the Alberta government has been playing hardball a little bit too. I mean, they've said that they've applied for a permit to allow for a lockout if things don't proceed in sort of a collegial fashion. So we will see what happens with that. I mean, as you mentioned, these are a lot of crucial roles in the government, and I think the provincial government has identified it's about 6,000 people who will be designated um, crucial, critical employees, and they will not be allowed to go on strike. So it's going to be sort of a longer simmering kind of thing, I think, but a strike does not at this moment seem imminent.
Okay. All right, back to Smith here. Premier Smith announcing that the province will be placing an indefinite freeze on the industrial carbon tax. So how will Ottawa see this action, Tyler?
Yeah, it's a good question because Alberta had sort of agreed with Ottawa a few years ago that there was going to be sort of a steady increase to the industrial carbon tax. It was, I think, supposed to go up to $110 per ton of emissions in 2026, and I believe was going to go all the way up to $170 a ton by 2030. So I guess the question is whether or not the Alberta government, or sorry, the federal government, is going to say, look, we agreed on this. You can't sort of back out on it. And the Alberta government has said that they're hoping for some sort of negotiation with the feds over this. But the logic on this was, look, we're in a sort of a tense economic situation, and an increase to the industrial carbon tax would sort of impair development and things like that. So you can see the logic of the Alberta government in doing this. Whether the feds are sympathetic to that, I think, is a different question.
Yeah. The province also unveiled a 10-year plan aimed at ending gender-based violence. And the strategy looks like it's going to focus on increasing awareness of what gender-based violence actually is and what Albertans should do when they see it. So, Tyler, can you tell us a little bit more about this strategy?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, it's a 10-year strategy. So it's quite, this is looking quite far down the road. Certainly is encompassing the next couple provincial elections. And it'll be interesting to keep an eye on whether it's another conservative government or whether the New Democrats take over, what bits and pieces of this plan are sort of kept. And it will be, rolling out over the subsequent years. It sounds like the first thing that's going to come up is this sort of advertising campaign, outreach campaign, part of it addressed to men and boys to sort of raise awareness of this. There's also going to be a focus on sort of Indigenous led participation in this and direction of this. So that's certainly something to keep an eye on as well. The New Democrats, of course, the New Democrats existing as the opposition to criticize things, say that this should have been started 18 months ago when the UCP was first reelected, and saying that it doesn't do very much for people experiencing gender-based violence now. So other than that, though, I don't know if anyone's going to be all that upset that the provincial government is trying to take a stand on this. And there's going to be a few other things, reporting and requirements and statistical gathering and stuff like that, just to have a better idea of the scope of the problem in the province.
Yeah, for sure. Tyler, it looks like measles cases continue to be on the rise, and I believe Alberta's got the second highest rate per province across the country, 374 cases now. Is the province doing anything to sort of lower this infection rate? What's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, so there's the regular kind of stuff that is done. They're notifying people of possible exposures and things like that. If you were at grocery store X on Tuesday night at whatever time, you can look on the Alberta Health website to find that information to know if you might have been exposed. And they've also sort of said they're going to be sort of pushing harder to get people vaccinated, especially children, because measles can be dangerous and deadly, especially for children. So, and that's sort of the main reason why this is spreading, right? Is because there are quite low measles vaccination rates in some communities. I think you need about 90% coverage with the vaccine to reach sort of herd immunity. And so, obviously in areas where that's not the case, measles is going to spread. It is one of, if not the most easily spreadable viruses that humans can get, much more transmissible than the COVID-19 virus, for example. So that's really sort of what's going on. They're going to try and tackle the vaccination thing, because it's really the best and frankly the only way to get a handle on the problem.
Yeah, I remember back when we were kids in school, sort of lining up, going to the school gym, all of us, a mass vaccination all at once. I thought it was mandatory back then. I guess it's not anymore.
Well, yeah, and it is mandatory in some provinces that kids in public schools need to have vaccines. It's not mandatory here, which could be a factor in this. But Ontario, which has the highest number of cases at the moment, they do have mandatory vaccinations in schools. So probably a factor, but hard to say, exactly how much of a factor.
All right. Tyler Dawson, legislative correspondent for the National Post. Thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.